Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. I'm sure you know by now, based off the runtime of this video, that you're in for a doozy of an RPG horror story. This 4-part series is about an individual named Craig, and it's called An Exercise in Lack of Self-Awareness. I'm going to let these stories speak for themselves and chime in here and there between the stories, so please sit back and enjoy this special episode. Like and subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right into it. The first story is called You Stole My Waifu. This is a story from a few years back when I still studied at the university. My gaming group consisted of a mix of study mates and older friends, all aged in their early to mid-20s. The group was great and still keeps together nowadays, about 8 years later. Well, except for one guy. A classic that guy with a particular lack of self-awareness. This is the story about the many red flags he raised and him ultimately leaving the campaign. The first big campaign we played together used the Anima Beyond Fantasy system, a niche and kind obscure Spanish TTRPG that is basically high fantasy on super cocaine. Highly recommended. We still play it. I was the ST and had 4 players, Charlie playing a surprisingly deep barbarian from the far north with a penchant for eating raw birds, occasional cannibalism, and hacking people to pieces with war axes. The second player, Jacob, rolled a hardcore survivalist and martial artist from a jungle country that acted as the grown-up in the group. Jacob was probably the greatest player in the campaign, and his character went through an amazing evolution, but that is a story for another time, and definitely another subforum. Thirdly was Jake, that played a circus runaway wizard psychic, yes that is a thing, and it is awesome, that accidentally killed himself in an arcane mishap. Jake eventually re-rolled a crazy elven wizard, which was great. Anyways, the 4th player was Craig, the focus of this story. He rolled an upbeat, chi-wielding Eastern monk that dripped of shonen protagonist material. I think his catchphrase was screaming springtime with youth from the top of his lungs and doing an obnoxious fist pump. Most of the time, Craig's character was fine, but along the road, Craig and his character started showing their true selves, much to the horror of the gaming group. The campaign started in a typical high fantasy fashion, the player characters being sold as slaves together in some remote shithole of the world. I think I even warned my players that an Elder Scrolls opening was coming, so they should prepare themselves for starting at absolute zero. The 4 players were captured along with 2 NPCs that would become both integral to the overarching plot, an old former priest and a young sorceress. Now this was the first session of the campaign, and from what I know now, the time the first red flag came up. Said sorceress named Rei was from an eastern land described in the setting as not Japan during the feudal era, with magic and katanas everywhere. As a result of her upbringing, again inspired by the time period that the eastern country emulated, she was very submissive, polite, and timid. Immediately after I described her, Craig had this strange look on his face, and he immediately had his character scoot over to try helping her, more or less ignoring the other fellow captives. Anyway, the group managed to overthrow the crew of the slave ship and took it for themselves. The group went on loads of adventures across the seas in their stolen slaver ship, fighting big bad evil guy and chthonic horrors left and right. Things were going fine, and we had loads of fun. With time, Craig's character's affection for Rei kept growing and eventually became mutual. Romance and all that was a natural part of the campaign by design, as it encouraged proper role-playing and character growth. I would say that we handled it quite well compared to all the horror stories I have read. Rei and Craig's character became intimate, which made Craig exceptionally happy. In between games, he wrote all these kinds of novels about his character's affection for Rei and sent them to me, unsuspecting of things to come as I graciously applauded his dedication to the game. At one point, Rei was separated from the group and for an extended amount of time. Craig was, expectedly, upset with this. He became increasingly quiet between sessions and did all sort of odd things in character. On the top of my head, I remember him once yelling out of character at another player that he wanted to carry an unconscious newbie girl instead of him. Jake, which played said character, just went, "Sure dude, whatever," and handed over the unconscious girl to Craig. It was as weird and awkward as it sounds. Eventually, Rei came back to the group and had undergone quite a radical transformation for reasons I will not go into here. Her personality, formerly submissive and timid, had become sarcastic, extrovert, and at times quite abrasive. This did not sit very well with Craig, as he was noticeably upset by this evolvement. After this point, 2 parallel stories unfolded, one in character and another out of character. In character, Rei and Craig's character just grew apart. Craig's character ignored Rei, and their relationship just fizzled out by lack of mutual interest. Such things happen, that's life. The more interesting story is how Craig handled it out of character. He became increasingly antagonistic towards Rei, yawned, rolling his eyes and making remarks whenever she did or said anything. I remember him saying, Can't he just shut the F up out of character at one point? The group tried to ignore his strange behavior the best it could. The strangeness became even more apparent since the problem with Ray's transformation was limited only to Craig. The other players found Ray amusing, funny, and a bit sad at the time. In other words, her inclusion in the story was still appreciated, and they thought she was a great character, but for Craig, his love turned into bitter hatred for his lost waifu. After some time, he decided to switch character in an effort to cut away the no doubt strange concoction of feelings he was having about Ray. Still, even with the new character on the table, he could not bear the sight of her. His hatred doubled when he found out that Ray had moved on from Craig's shonen hero character that had also physically left the group and became involved with Jake's crazy elven wizard. Out of character, Craig was incredibly angry and upset about this. We, as in Craig and myself, spent God knows how many hours talking about the issue, trying to find some way to solve it. Or at least I tried with my non-existent degree in psychology. It felt like I was giving actual relationship advice to Craig, which was incredibly bizarre and a bit distressing at the same time. The new character did not last long. Craig decided to leave the group for personal reasons and not having any time to roleplay. After leaving the campaign, he told me that he felt personally betrayed, especially for giving away Ray to Jake. At this point, I was pretty fed up with the obsessive rants, but did not want to antagonize him any more than necessary. I kind of just said that I was sorry that things turned out the way they did, but that one should be careful to separate character from player. Let's just say Craig didn't qualify for the national team of separating persona from person. To point out, there was no obstacle for Craig to continue pursuing Ray in her new and improved version. I had half expected him to get to know the new her, but I think he felt like it was too much of a chore as he had already won her and didn't want to bother doing it again. But I digress. I can't really say what was going on inside his head. Anyways, that was a long-winded story about a problematic player, Craig, leaving the campaign, which lasted for another 2 years before concluding in his absence. There are more stories about Craig being that guy, his ultimate meltdown that ended in him quitting the group and renouncing his friendship, his own bizarre campaigns, and many other weird tales. Tell me in the comments if you want to hear more about him. TLDR, player becomes smitten by NPC and freaks out when said NPC undergoes radical personal changes, spirals into madness as player obsessed over NPC out of character, and eventually leaves the campaign feeling personally betrayed by the loss of his waifu. Let me just say that we are off to a strong start, and I'm glad that the people in the comments section said that they wanted to hear more, because the story could have just been over right here. So quick takeaway from this, I really like that the author pointed out that sometimes players have a hard time separating the persona from the person, and Craig made this really obvious. Obviously, there was some kind of interesting hook that the DM wanted to introduce with this Ray character. Craig felt entitled to this waifu. The only thing I'm going to push back on the writer about this story is they said that they handled romance as well. But I think anytime you have it as an option, especially a bigger part of the campaign, as you said, you're going to run into problems like this. And when you gave his waifu like that makeover, and then when he seemed uninterested, you tried giving that NPC to another character, there's no way that wasn't going to go bad, man. I'm sorry. But let's not get caught up in that for too long, as there's so much more to reflect upon. The second story is called You Are Totally Not the Main Character. Hello everyone, due to popular demand, I've decided to write up another story in an exercise in lack of self-awareness series, as if that is a thing. This time it's about Craig being an ST, which appears to be the Dungeon Master term they use for this game. Strap yourselves in, get cozy, and prepare yourselves. This campaign was started sometime during my own Anima campaign. The group consists of the illustrious Craig, Jacob, Jake, and myself. When he pitched the idea, I had never heard of a system Exalted 2nd Edition by White Wolf. He made it sound like it was this over-the-top Greek-Chinese mythology madness cocktail of awesome and laser raptors. How could any decent person say no to that? Thing is, he was very stingy about player immersion and set up a significant rule. The players are not allowed to read the rule books. Only choice parts were open for reading, such as basic character creation and some snippets of the game's systems. That's nice, we players thought, and proceeded to create our characters. We essentially thought that this was some design choice to get us started on some high immersion campaign where meta-knowledge would ruin anything. Let's just say that some meta-knowledge would call out the campaign for the bullshit it became. Anyways, we rolled our characters. Strict orders were placed on us to not have any attribute or skill over 3, where 5 is the usual maximum. And we were allowed next to no supernatural powers. For those who know the setting and system, we started as unheroic, heroic mortals that had yet to exalt. Jake rolled a Savage Huntress from the southeastern creation, which is an area of incredibly dense forest coupled with badlands and all that. Her tribe had been brutally wiped out by a dark overlord named Masks of Winters, a name that meant nothing to Jake as it was suggested by Craig. Her name was Taya, and she was a competent archer, survivalist tracker, but had incredibly bad social skills. Jacob, while having a brain aneurysm, decided to roll an ancient old blind hag with an owl familiar that acted as her eyes. We all thought that character was incredibly bad, and Jacob later admitted to temporarily succumbing to insanity while creating her. He later changed character, we will get to that. My own character became the scum of the earth Zael. He was a complete fiend and probably the worst person to invite to a house party. His backstory was that he belonged to the middle nobility and that his family secretly worshipped some demonic entity. Being the youngest child, he had trouble proving his worth to his extensive collection of older brothers and sisters, whom were all objectively better than him. What he lacked in sense he made up with sheer lunacy, as he made some fell pact with the murder demon in the family basement and killed all of his closest family members and the staff at their estate. What a champ. I had noticed a background which as a category of bonuses at character creation called familiar. I had no idea where to spend my background points, so I spent the maximum possible 5 dots in it. Said familiar was a servant to the murder demon, a sleek panther that could turn into an equally dangerous and badass woman. Zael was a real edgelord, if I'm allowed to use a local nomenclature, but the idea was that he'd become a decent person and overcome his psychological problems. Craig was informed of my plans and gave me the thumbs up. The campaign started by our characters waking up in a secluded camp in the middle of nowhere. There were cannibals everywhere, and we three seemed to be the only recent catches. We managed to escape our bonds and started to formulate a plan to escape. Taya and Zael agreed that killing the ever-living Jesus out of the cannibals was the prudent thing to do. Taya was dishonored by her tribe's standards and needed to redeem herself. Zael just wanted to murder everyone forever. Anyways, battle ensued. It quickly became clear that Craig had absolutely no idea how to run the combat system. He spent the better part of an hour doing research straight out of the rulebook. First time playing, so it was quite understandable, but as a tip to all new DMs, don't plan a combat encounter unless you have at least a vague idea about the rules. We players had no clue as our access to the rulebooks was limited by law. After incredibly awkward combat, we ran off into the desert. I will not go into much detail about what happened as much of it is lost in the mists of memory. I will, however, go through the more amusing and alarming details of the campaign in a looser narrative. I hope it's fine with you guys. A mere session in, we met with a runaway princess from a crumbling kingdom. It quickly became clear that she was the MacGuffin of the campaign as Craig described her in great detail. She was a stoic but easily flustered armored princess that was clearly superior to all the player characters in every way. Her combat ability was way higher than ours. As you remember, we were only allowed a maximum of 3 of our attributes and skills instead of the usual 5. Kara, as her name was, sort of just ordered us to help her on her incredibly vague quest. We had no idea what was going on, some form of direction was appreciated. So we all went to follow the MacGuffin like some trail hands, not the heroic heroes of Dawn that we were promised to be. Speaking of Heroes of Dawn, one of the main ideas of the early parts of the campaign was that we should all exalt. Now normally mortals become exalt in specific circumstances. For instance, a scholar might become a Twilight caste when she realizes some fundamental truth about the world. A soldier might become a Dawn caste when facing impossible odds in the battlefield, and so forth. It is basically an incredible power boost that permanently makes a character larger than life and is awesome in every conceivable way. Craig had a wholly different interpretation of the act of exaltation. He did it by bits and crumbs. All our characters, oh by the way, Jacob changed characters to a well-spoken sorcerer's apprentice after his crazy old lady sort of just wandered off into the desert. The new guy's name was Geist, and he knew terrestrial sorcery at character creation while being mortal. Yeah, that was totally fair. Anyways, back to the exaltations. One by one, we started noticing subtle differences in ourselves, doing things slightly better or doing spontaneous miraculous feats. We, at least what I know of, had these visions of an old wise master standing on water and all that. Instead of getting all that kaboom boom at once, as dictated by all the rules we were drip fed one agonizing charm at a time. For those who don't know, a charm is essentially a magical power that allows you to do increasingly crazy things, from jumping several dozen feet straight into the air, to cutting down swaths of enemies with the speed of sunlight. Craig did the drip feeding mostly between sessions. We would have these mini sessions where we were rewarded by a charm, of his choosing of course. We never really got any agency when it came to the character progression. Zail mainly got athletics charms that allowed him to become exceptionally mobile, but he got no means of proper defense or attack. I think he never once during the campaign was at full health due to being a melee fighter without the ability to defend himself. Instead, he was just jumping around like a total a-hole. Taya got next to nothing while Geist got sorcery as charms. Yeah, that's totally how it works. It just became even better when a new player, Mike, joined. He had played Exalted before and got to roll a full solar gasp. Mike was a bit confused by the way things were handled by Craig and told him, dude, that's totally not how exaltations work. Craig just told him to shut the F up and let him run his game the way he wanted. I am convinced that the homebrewing and modifications of standard settings and systems is totally fine, as long as you inform your players. Craig, however, had created a perfect solution. He had prohibited us from knowing the truth and unable to realize his bullshit. The problem was the method of drip feeding was that Craig was playing favorites. Jake, who Craig had some sort of issue with, got next to nothing. Jacob, on the other hand, was super busy most evenings, so he had no time to do these mini sessions for those sweet, sweet charms. Myself, on the other hand, was basically courted with invites from Craig. Zail had all these sorts of adventures by himself, and got to learn various plot-related information. Pro tip, don't do that. Player information should at least be shared, at least if it's related to the main plot. As such, Zail got significantly more useful and powerful than his peers. Jacob and Jake and I laughed heartily after the campaign came to its abrupt end that Taya had like one charm which allowed her to shoot arrows at large distances. The problem was that she could not shoot for shit to begin with, as all enemies were scaled to match Geist's sorcery, Kara's epic swordsmanship, and Zail's idiot jumping. Speaking of Kara, she was some form of homebrew prototype solar that had exaltation tattooed into her body. Pretty sure that is from another anime Craig had watched. You guys tell me if you know. She was leagues above us when it came to being useful and solved entire situations by herself. And of course, she was never wrong. We had, as I might remember, no idea what was going on in creation, and everything Kara said turned out to be true and correct. Nice going, Craig. I'd almost forgotten Zail's murder demon familiar. The badass panther was named Raga, and she turned out to be the most underpriced familiar ever made. If it wasn't enough with the overpowered Kara, Raga was a total combat powerhouse, and became an increasingly important character to the plot. Something lost demon queen something. She also made numerous advancements on Zail to no one's surprise. Kara did too. They obviously could not resist his sociopathic charm. Raga even ended a boss battle by herself at one point. We are all after the serial killer that made portraits out of the blood of his victims. He had said to be a total badass, demon-possessed mastermind. Guess what happens? Round 1, Raga won initiative. Every player said, but she's not even here. Craig said, just wait. Then Raga materializes behind the badass painter and shreds him to strips of flesh and tasty blood mist in one attack. Really climactic. Especially bad considering Mike, whom played the party's face, wanted to talk with the painter about what had made him so powerful. Perhaps he had some fell master that was a real threat. Nope, that would not do, Craig thought. Over time, a major problem started to become evident. Zail had slowly become the main character of the campaign. Craig gave him exclusive essential information, which I thought was completely nuts. He also placed these awkwardly sexualized women at his feet. Craig even threw in, I swear to God, underage girl at Zail and had me roll temperance, which governed self-control, to not have his way with her. Thankfully, I passed the check. Great, I thought he was making a harem that no one asked for? That's just dandy. I went as far as Craig saying to me in private that Zail was more important than the other player characters. I was quite distressed by this and asked him to distribute Spotlight more fairly, but my pleas fell upon deaf ears. The campaign was incredibly unfocused, completely lacking an overarching plot in favor of Craig's whim of the week. Weird things just happened one by one, some of them amusing, others less so. For example, we visited Geist's master, whom was a deranged magician that had sent him into the world in search for panties. Zail had rolled temperance to not hug the underage girl to death, which failed, turning her into a sidereal exalted for some inexplicable reason. Zail was forced into copulating with a water nymph, which was almost instantly produced a fully aged son that Zail couldn't handle. That was a right mess without any direction to speak of. Eventually, Jake started to lose interest by the unfair treatment. He made minimum effort during sessions, and I don't blame him. His actions were mostly ignored, and he was never really encouraged or rewarded for doing things. Jacob, being a sweet angel of kindness, tried to have fun and to ignore the obvious favoritism. I mostly felt incredibly guilty for having to become the de facto main character of the story, but tried to shift the focus as best I could. Nope, that would not do, said Craig, and shifted it right back. The campaign ended in the most undignified way possible. It was put on permanent ice after Craig found a new TTRPG system to obsess over. His interest in Exalted had passed, and he had said he had lost inspiration. After the campaign was over, I was told that his plan for the endgame, he used that term, yes, was that Raga would return in her Demon Queen form with the Sword of Creation, which is a powerful global defense system, not a physical sword, and would kill all the gods with it. He said that it was up to Zael, not the party, to redeem her, or some bullshit like that. Yikes. Now, the moral of the story is, don't pick favorites amongst your players, don't take away agency of character progression from the players, don't follow your whims when it comes to campaign design, don't keep players in the dark when it comes to settings and systems, and for the love of God, don't force players to have to roll something to avoid effing underage girls. TLDR, ST obfuscates facts, has a field day on everything that is holy with the system and setting, removes player agency and plays favorites, realizes that people don't like that sort of thing, and abruptly cancels the whole campaign. There are 2 more stories about Craig that comes to mind. The one is about a promising Pathfinder / Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition campaign being mismanaged into oblivion, while another is about Craig's ultimate meltdown. Tell me in the comments below if you're interested in reading them. After reading the second story, I totally feel like I'm at a loss for words. Luckily, the writer does a very good job of giving us a moral to the story. By all means, don't do any of the stuff that was stressed at the end of this story. And I like that in this situation, Azur, the writer here, they actually are the person who's the favorite, and they still don't like it. They have to deal with 2 DMPCs because obviously the familiar that this character has becomes a main character. The second DMPC, of course, is what would be like his waifu insert Kara, which is this very overpowered mentor / leader who gets to basically do everything, I guess. I don't know, this whole story's just throwing me off so bad that I can't imagine what the next 2 are going to be. I'm a little scared. It is very concerning that there's so many things he made the players roll with. Having the role to restrain yourself to not assault people that you, the player character, don't want to sleep with is a cause for concern, to say the very least. Now that Chris Hansen's back in the picture, I wonder if he's going to ask this man to take a seat. I like that the writer was optimistic about the whole not being shown the system thing. Obviously, the DM was really trained in it, or he had like a cool spin of a homebrew of a system everyone's played in the past. It could be interesting going into a game dark. This wasn't the case, though. It seems like it was more of a power play and a way for him to get away with experimenting on stuff that no one would like otherwise, which I think is just a bad faith thing to do as a DM. You're intentionally choosing not to communicate with your players, creating a worse environment. And if you want to play a low-powered game, just say that. Don't limit what people can pick in character creation, and then give them the powers you think are balanced and appropriate when you don't even really know the system yourself. On to the next story. This one's called Don't Ruin My Scene. This is the third story in an Exercise in Lack of Self-Awareness series. It takes place in a parallel with the Anima campaign described in Part 1, and after the Exalted campaign in Part 2. I suggest reading them before diving into this rather lengthy story. After the anticlimactic ending of Craig's Exalted campaign, he flung back and forth about which TTRPG system to run next. A lot of systems were up for discussion, and Craig's whims were difficult to follow. He knew what setting he wanted because it was one of his own making. The problem was finding a system that was just right. At one point, he even tried to jailbreak and overhaul the Anima Beyond Fantasy system to meet his ends. I strongly recommend it otherwise, as overhauling a system usually ends in a complete mess. In the end, we settled for Pathfinder, as we all were interested in trying it and found it dynamic enough to meet Craig's criteria. Roll call. Exact same people joined this campaign as the previous. Craig took the position of glorious GM, while Jacob, Jake, and I joined as players. A bit further into the story, Mike once again joined. As for the characters, oh wait, I think it's easier describing the setting before getting to the characters. Trust me, it will make sense. The premise of the setting was great, not gonna lie. It was an underground setting where the surface had been blasted into a hellish wasteland by demonic gods. The survivors evacuated to a gigantic underground metropolis called Hemea Erie. In the deep dark, people started mining into the vast caverns in search for resources. They found certain crystals of condensed light that acted as a power source, creating a steampunkish low fantasy society. A certain ethnicity of humans whom called themselves the Ladian had built Hamea Iri, and they quickly constructed an autocratic and fascist hierarchy, placing themselves at the very top and the lesser people at the rock bottom. Amongst these people at the bottom were the cursed rock elves or grey elves that acted as slaves in the menial labor. Craig told us that the party would be explorers, diplomats, and adventurers from Hamea Iri. When Craig pitched the idea, we all thought, oh yeah, that sounds great. Perhaps he learned from his mistakes and has become a great game master. Sadly, our hopes and dreams would be quickly crushed beneath Craig's boot heel. I roll a Ladian magus named Leon. He was a very young and naive half-Ladian that attended to what can only be described as steampunk magic school. Leon's dad was a renowned alchemist and explorer that had gone missing for the better part of his life. The mother was unknown but implied to be a human of lesser pedigree. I had told Craig that I wanted Leon's origin obfuscated. For example, I had left hints that Leon might be a simulacrum, a crafted human made by his father. Plot fodder for the GM, I guess. Anyways, Leon was a scholar and a kind-hearted person as a result of me wanting to wash away the moist suit of Zael from the Exalted campaign. He was bullied at school for not being a true-born Ladian, but he tried his best to fit in. The first session came in. Leon was attending a school assembly due to state leaders coming to visit. Craig described these extravagantly clad people walking down the rows and rows of saluting students. It quickly became clear that the state leaders were evil as hell. They all had menacing auras, especially a scary-looking bodyguard. He showed Raiden from Metal Gear Revengeance. Their symbol was, I kid you not, a photoshopped combination of the Third Reich Imperial Eagle holding the Star Wars Empire symbol instead of a swastika. Alright, I thought, perhaps we're going to overthrow these obvious baddies. None of the other player characters were in sight, so I just went along. The state arranged a huge fighting tournament for their amusement and to instill discipline in the student body. Leon, being a capable fencer, joined and beat the snot out of one of his bullies. The first day of the visit came to an end and Leon retreated back to his dorm room. When preparing for bed, Leon felt a huge rumble from underneath. He went out of his dorm room and ran into one of his fellow students. Together they started walking towards the assembly hall bunker for safety. Their escape was cut short when the ground gave way beneath them, causing them to tumble several floors down. When they came to, they found themselves in one of the older parts of the academy, where students were not allowed. Leon and the other student wandered around in hope of finding an exit when they heard footsteps. In came a group of stone elves. As a reminder, they were the oppressed slave race of the Leoden, headed by none other than Jacob's character. Now, I must admit that Jacob really outdid himself when it came to his character. His name was Basal, and he was an utterly terrifying dude belonging to a mysterious faction called Deep Walkers, or something like that. The faction were an independent group of explorers, navigators, and guides. This faction was an independent group of explorers and navigators and guides that adhered to a strict code of conduct and took upon themselves the sacred task of helping explorers enter the deep horrors below Hamea Iri. Mechanically, Basal was a witch, and boy did he play one well. He always wore a haunting, obsolete gas mask and a grand coat. His familiar was a nasty shadow demon that only created silhouettes against whatever backdrop it passed by. I mentioned Basal was scary, and it was due to Jacob's betrayal of him. He had utter confidence and stoicism combined with streaks of face-eating madness. Whatever Craig would throw at us in the way of horror paled in comparison to Jacob's Basal. Glorious. Anyways, back to Leon. Understandably, the detachment of Grey Elves were not very pleased to see a pale-faced young Ledian crossing their path. The only reason he wasn't killed was that Basal told the group that he had not agreed to any deaths. Instead, Leon and his classmate became captured by the Grey Elves. In short order, the group came into a lab where they found a prisoner that they freed. Enter Jake's character, Embla. She was a particularly large Grey Elf that had been subject to experimental treatment by her captors. Over her entire body was silvery markings that she sort of hijacked to create supernatural feats. Mechanically, she was a monk. Alright then, the group's destination was freeing Craig's MacGuffin from the camp. You guessed it, she was a woman described in great detail. Her name was Chichil, and she possessed an extremely rare affinity for light crystals used to power all magic and science. Leon was quite pleased to have another lady in, but Chichil quickly made it clear that she cared little for imperialist scum. Yay? After rescuing Chichil, the group started to escape the academy via the underways. One crashed escape ship later, and the group were on their merry way towards rejoining the tunnel-lurking rebels. Mike joined later on as a Grey Elf barbarian named Grey. He had a hair trigger and an Oedipus complex. Not much else to say, really. As you probably realize, Leon was the odd man out. The group somehow took favor upon his fellow student, but his own treatment was abysmal. I will relate to you some of the memorable sections of the campaign in somewhat chronological order. When exploring the deep depths of the caverns below, Leon had totally stressed out and punched Basil into unconsciousness. He left him lying in the darkness and went back to camp. The others said that he would be fine as his familiar would surely take care of him. Nope, that did not happen. Instead, Craig thought that his otherwise innocuous character building moment should spiral out of control and make everyone uncomfortable. You see, one part of the code that Basil followed was that it was absolutely forbidden to leave anyone behind in the tunnels. Breaking that code, even if you had no idea about it, would result in what they called exaction, which is essentially an impromptu court of law. Jacob had no idea about this, and the next session was dedicated to forcing PvP between Leon and Basil. It was not an honorable duel or something like that, but a drawn-out torturous experience where Basil would cast all manners of nasty spells on Leon until he finally gave up. Jake's character could do nothing to interfere with this horrifying ordeal and said next to nothing for the entire session. Jacob kept trying to have Basil let Leon get off easy, as he was not much more than a child, but Craig would have none of that. At times, Craig even said, "Your character does this because otherwise his peers would kill him for breaking the rules." Great, everyone thought. Keep up the travesty no one asked for. Finally, it ended with Leon humiliating himself before Basil, basically groveling in his own blood and dirt to ask for forgiveness. Later on, the party entered some bizarre pocket world where a mad sorcerer king reigned. We all thought it was a bit strange as it looked more akin to the standard fare medieval Europe Dungeons & Dragons playground, rather than the intended steampunkish techno-magic exploration simulator. Oh well, we thought, and went on with it. I can't remember why we entered that horrid place. Maybe it was just another obstacle in the journey towards the other rebels. Anyways, the pocket world was a really dark and gothic landmass of villages in a larger central city. Most of the populace were nothing more than mine slaves, while the undead walked the land without opposition. We quickly ran into one of the most obnoxious characters Craig ever designed, Figaro the hero. He was a second-rate Batman combined with a happy-go-lucky attitude that made everyone grind their teeth and cringe. Worse was that Figaro was more or less forced upon us, as this guy looks trustworthy and holds strings to all plot hooks. F me, we all thought, and went with the idiot vigilante. Figaro was one of the few remaining free folk, and he had taken it upon himself to rid the pocket world of tyrannical Sorcerer King, one undead lieutenant at a time. As you imagine, we were roped into this ploy at instant speed. We were sent out to ambush a supply caravan carrying slaves from the central city to some hellish mine or something. Being the clever players that we were, we sneaked upon towards the caravan while it still loaded the poor souls. Hoping to get a jump on the lieutenant, Embla, Jake's character, went ahead and crept upon the wooden wall to peek out from. When peeking at the caravan, she was met with a guard looking her right into the face. Then Craig lifted up his 5 fingers and started counting down 5, 4, 3. Jake just said, "Easy man, let me get a read on what happens around. Are there any other guards? Any other cover? 2, 1. Too bad." Then Craig rolled attack for the guard and said that Embla was flat-footed, which is a combat state in Pathfinder that you get from having lower initiative and other things, giving you penalties to your defenses. Of course the guard critted and Embla went down like a wet napkin. The rest rushed in and spent nearly everything they had on the battle, barely scraping by. We all thought that was pretty bullshit. Oh yeah, and they mentioned that Craig ran his combat encounters really brutal. Most of them required every single resources at our disposal, leaving our characters barely breathing by the end of them. It didn't help that he was extremely restrictive with loot and equipment. We voiced this concern with Craig numerous times, and he showed his vast gratitude by bestowing Embla with chainmail armor. The problem was Embla was a monk and gained nothing from wearing armor. I should also mention that the problem of character agency made a grand return in this campaign. If you ever read about his Exalted campaign, you know that Craig liked to change our characters around to create plot. Now, Leon was a vanilla magus, and I wanted him that way. Craig thought it wasn't cool enough and made him a Blackblade magus, which is a variation of the base class with some modifications to wield a titular black blade. It didn't help that the Blackblade was a sadistic death demon that wanted to drive Leon into genocide and murder. That is what I get for trying to play a nice character. I still wonder why I just accepted such blatant disregard for my own character agency. Back to Figaro the hero. I had become quite fed up by Craig's treatment of my character. The constant bullying, lack of agency, broken promises, and questionable ethics on encounter design had really added up. I asked to change my character, which was accepted. Leon was, on Craig's behest, killed off by a magic MacGuffin box we picked up earlier. Enter my new character, Ryra Reaver. She was, unlike Leon, a native of the deep dark below and lived in the said pocket dimension. Her backstory was that she suddenly woke up, fully grown, in one of the old temples near one of the free folk villages. She faintly remembered living amongst the stars and falling towards the depths. In essence, she was a quasi-angelic being sent to this world for unknown reasons. Her class was a notoriously powerful synthesis sorcerer, which I suggest you read up on if you're ever interested in broken builds. I can't claim that I fully optimized her, but I certainly made her considerably more powerful than the wimpy Leon. Playing the constant arm race between Craig and the other players, I had no moral trouble with creating Rira. Her synthesis form, if you are interested, is sort of a diva angel demon straight out of Hindu Chinese folklore, complete with dozens of invisible arms and hovering a few inches above the air. Rira was rather quickly introduced to the remaining party as we were very inclined to have the tyrant sorcerer king gone from the world. Without much hassle, the new party was formed and they went to the Big Bad Evil Guy Citadel 1.0. The way up was brutal as F, as Craig usually liked it. Close to the top was a coliseum-like arena where we were forced to fight some gigantic sandworm. It really did a number on us and mortally wounded Figaro the hero. The crowd of undead didn't much care for us actually surviving entertainment and started to flood the coliseum grounds. The sense of urgency to escape was rather confusing as Craig described Figaro heroically delivering his final words to his wife, who was with us. As none of us really cared for Figaro, we said that we started to look for a way out. And then out of nowhere, Craig screamed, "Don't ruin my scene," at us. We were all dumbfounded by this and sat there quiet. Then Craig proceeded to finish his heart-wrenching dialogue while our characters obediently stood and watched. Afterwards, Craig said, "Don't interrupt me when I'm talking again." It sounded like a threat. After the sobering experience, we finally reached the Big Bad Evil Guy. He was sitting on his throne and gloated a bit. Something about power over death, you know, the usual stuff. In unison, we attacked him, rushing towards his throne. Then Craig said, "Roll a fortitude save." Some of us rolled really high, but we all failed regardless. We were essentially pinned down by a magical vortex. When we tried to ask for a reroll on the save, Craig proudly said, "There's no way you can escape. This is a level 9 spell, and you have to nat 20 to get out." Some of us tried, but rolling 20 on demand is not really a trainable skill. Then Craig turned his face towards me and said something along the lines of, "You feel a power growing inside you." And Rira managed to escape her bounds, without any roll to speak of. Then the Big Bad Evil Guy, being as generically as humanly possible, staggered back and said, "Impossible." Craig then described how Rira ran towards him with her sword raised. He looked childishly delighted as he put on some epic music and asked, "Now how does Rira finish him?" I looked around the table. My fellow players had a mix of disgust and confusion on their faces. Understandable, as the climactic confrontation with the Big Bad Evil Guy had been reduced to a cutscene-esque power trip. Craig, on the other hand, looked like he had just witnessed the most awesome thing ever made. I felt rather uncomfortable and couldn't really share his enthusiasm, so I just went with a lot of screaming and stabbing with pointy things. Big Bad Evil Guy dead. Yay. After the anticlimax, we proceeded on our pointless quest towards the rebel base. It actually felt like we were getting further away from it by the session, instead of getting closer. Mike switched out the Barbarian Grey for a real edgelord lady and runaway inquisitor named Michael. The new addition was constantly grumpy and did not add much to the group dynamics. Now we get to Craig's grand design, a massive pyramid built by the obligatory proto-race. I have no idea how we came across it. It just showed up and of course we had to explore it. Just before entering this massive structure, which Craig called an epic dungeon, the game fell apart. Craig just got sick of running Pathfinder and sulked for a few months about how inconvenient the system was. Eventually he found himself back and announced we would change systems, because why not? Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was up next. Naturally, we had to basically redo our characters from scratch, and we did our best to fluff our abilities to fit our themes. It didn't go that well. Basal, which used to be a strange and wonderful witch, became a shaman. Instead of being the nasty badass of curses and diseases, he became a glorified healer with a severely crippled familiar. Rira, being a synthesis sorcerer, had no clear counterpart in 4th edition, so she became a druid, shape-shifting and all that. Jake, whom was actually happy with the change of system, he still loathes Pathfinder to this day due to the crippled monk class, had Embla be a warden. Instead of smashing people with her fists, she got a big old hammer to pummel her foes into dust. It worked out rather well. Lastly, Mike's Inquisitor became a Blackguard variant of the Paladin class. As a bonus of changing systems, Craig sort of understood the need for gear and items when running a very combat-oriented system. We got to choose a few magical items each, which was amazing. Sadly, those starting items are all we were going to get. Anyways, back to the pyramid of highly original forebearer races. The whole thing was a massive techno-magical death trap filled with bullshit traps and failed attempts at ambient horror. I can't remember everything that happened in there over the course of several sessions, but I will mention a few. Embla had a cart of sorts that she pulled along the group. It was filled with resources, food, and some equipment needed to survive the depths. When we entered the pyramid, we came across an elevator that took us to the entrance proper. Quickly, the entrance crumbled as the ancient systems had power outage, sealing us inside. Jake said that Embla retrieved a glow lamp from the cart to help with the darkness. Craig said, "No, you left the cart at the elevator." Jake, surprised, answered, "No, why would I do that? All the food and stuff is in there." Craig was quite bothered by being questioned by Jake and said, "No, you left it. It would look stupid to bring it along." He shut down any attempts for either Jake or the other players. Of course, it would look way too silly to bring in a dingy cart into the epic dungeon. A few sessions in and we entered a completely dark room. We were asked to roll stealth and we all rolled quite well. He said we heard some grinding noise from an unknown location. He asked us with an evil grin on his face what our characters did. I said that Rira took a wary step and lifted her head up in an attempt to hear from where the sound came, hoping to perhaps roll perception. Craig rolled a die, asked, "What's your AC?" Like 18, I answered. "That is not high enough," Craig said, his grin widening. Then he went on to describe how Rira was grabbed by a slimy tentacle thing that violently pulled her into the dark and away from the group. I asked for a save to get free from this rather unpleasant thingamajig, but was shut down with, "No, Rira does not know what is going on." The rest of the group navigated the darkness by Rira's confused screams, which took them like 5 minutes. At the end, they found her hanging upside down from the roof in a wide room lit with fires. Craig drew a battle grid, which is necessary when playing 4th edition, and placed Rira's token right in the middle of the utter shit. She was surrounded by, I kid you not, a bunch of demonic little ape things that tried to reach her. Around the ape things were a ring of fire and noxious fumes, and after that, a freaking ditch of dirt. The rest of the group entered far, far away from her. Initiative starts, she falls down and immediately downed by the noxious fumes and the ape things. Another one of Craig's classic bullshit battles ensues, spending us to the other limit. Those of you who have played with 4th edition know that combat is treated as a steady progression and increasingly difficult encounters over the course of an adventuring day. Craig didn't care much for that, and was content with throwing one massive battle at us every adventuring day. Astute readers will most likely realize that Second Wind, a way of regaining HP, does not really favor such designs. Later came the epic final showdown with the demonic denizens of the pyramid. Craig had prepared it for a long time indeed. We entered through a gigantic door into a massive spherical room where gravity allowed you to walk on all the walls. There was these nodes of pulsating flesh knots like hearts spread out everywhere. We quickly realized Craig intended to replicate a 3-dimensional battle grid built by much more skilled designers than him. Craig spent like an hour in a fumbling attempt to draw this complicated 3D map on a 2D surface. We had made a big wax mat we used for that sort of thing. We tried to help him simplify the mat, but he accepted no help whatsoever. He drew arrows just about everywhere to represent height differences and interconnected paths. The whole thing was a true blasphemy. When I finally was done, he put out our tokens at the entrance and spread out other tokens to represent the nasty demons inside the Death Sphere. At the middle was a nasty piece of work, a scythe-wielding witch that starred the obligatory evil monologue. Right in the middle of it, I said, "Rira has no reason to listen to this abomination. She casts a spell right at her face." Craig's eyes were lit up with hatred and said, "Oh, you want to play like that? Sure." Then prompted everyone to roll initiative. Of course, the enemy won initiative and utterly swarmed us. Now imagine this, dear reader. He had spent an hour preparing a massive battle map, but used only 5x5 of it. We were bogged down by a horde of enemies right at the mouth of the entrance, creating a reverse bottleneck for the entire party. When every demon lay dead, we ran around to destroy the flesh knots, which I'm sure he intended to be done in a more dynamic way. You know, with mobility being a key factor and action management being important. He played himself and ruined the whole encounter. As a curious side note, we had an NPC with us, a sort of foster uncle of Rira that had tagged along. In the middle of the swamped battle, Craig described how he got a sword pierced through his neck, through his body, and out his lower back. Holy shit, we thought. He just died. After that, Craig berated us for not healing the NPC, as he was actually alive and was doing death saves. Nice going. He made it sound like it was our fault. After cleansing the pyramid, we reached the central control room. We were showered in plot by ancient AI entity. The AI described our true selves, Rira being some sort of light goddess from a faraway dimension, Basal, an avatar of a god of balance between life and death, Michael, fragments of a god of justice. hey, this sounded mightily familiar to the plot of my parallel running Anima campaign, which it was. It was a shameless ripoff. As a final insult to Jake's character, whom Craig despised, he revealed that he was not a goddess, but a temple guard to some fire god. Playing favorites is truly a virtue. The AI left after showing us some wish-making machine to create magical artifacts. You know, instead of giving us proper loot and stuff to give us a decent chance at survival, he had to make this complicated system for fabricating said items. The system involved some sort of magical currency and writing a short story to Craig about what we wanted. The wish-making machine was never used as Craig put the campaign on permanent ice. He claimed to have lost inspiration and lamented how his initial steampunk setting had evolved into generic European fantasy. You did all that by yourself, I'm afraid. Craig went on to obsess over other game systems and made a few failed attempts at running other campaigns. I'm finished being a player in his campaigns and had no interest in joining. What I heard from the players was more of the same described herein. There we go, another anticlimax from Craig's Forge of Wonders. There is just one part left, which takes place after my Anima campaign had ended and we joined up for a one-shot module. It's about Craig's ultimate meltdown and how he left the group for good. Let me hear if you want to read it. TLDR. Game Master oversells his own setting and mismanages it into oblivion, making sure to create as bumpy as a ride as possible. We love Craig. We love Craig. We love Craig. We love Craig. Man, playing with Craig sounds like a nightmare. So I understand I've been guilty of starting a campaign and wanting to switch systems halfway through. In my case, it was 3.5, wanting to change it to Pathfinder. But it seems like that's the transition that he handled best. Everything else was a complete shit show. There seems to be this continuing theme of favoritism. He really doesn't like Jake's character, and he really likes this main writer's characters. They describe it as a cutscene, which I think is very appropriate because their character is able to magically be free, go up, and essentially execute the boss without dealing any meaningful damage. I don't even know if they started the combat based on the description. Like maybe there was an earlier scrimmage or something, but no, it just seems like another one-shot scenario, like how the familiar got to tear the painter to shreds in part 2. They also managed to create another DMPC in this Figaro the Hero guy. And then when he doesn't get his moment because no one cared about the dude to begin with, he literally yells at the players to never interrupt him again, which is kind of wild. It really does seem like in many ways it's got all the bad parts from part 2, minus the harem. So, you know, boys, I think he's improving a little bit. I'm really excited to see what's going to go on in this fourth one. It is a shame, though, that the plot seemed really good, but the fact that it started off as this interesting steampunk setting and devolved into a pocket dimension medieval fantasy, yeah, you did that. Like, literally no one told them they had to go into the pyramid, but of course you want them to go into the pyramid because you designed several sessions worth of content in a mega dungeon for the pyramid. If the pyramid isn't steampunky enough for you, make it more steampunk, or just pass it entirely. It seems like Craig gets really angry when no one does what he wants and he'll make them do it. But here you have them following his decisions and all his decisions pointed towards going more fantasy than steampunk. And then he's mad at the party for following his cues that he railroads them on. I'm curious to see what his meltdown is, because if all these outbursts are not a true meltdown yet, you know you're going to be in for a good story for part 4. So let's jump right into it. The fourth and final story is called Craig's Meltdown. This story is a long time coming. Been busy with, life and stuff. Anyways, here's the concluding part of the saga of Craig, an exercise in lack of self-awareness 4. The concluding part takes place after Craig left the Anima Beyond Fantasy campaign, described in part 1, and well after the train wreck that was his own 2 campaigns, as described in part 2 and part 3. At this stage in our lives, we were well through our university education with just a few years left to go. Craig had at this time remarked a lack of time to enjoy the glorious role-playing hobby. His reasons were always vague and unclear, but I digress. During the winter, our regular campaigns without Craig had taken a small break for exams and stuff. To let loose some steam and take the pressure off our studies, I quickly threw together a Hunter the Vigil, New World of Darkness by White Wolf game. The idea was to use a pre-made scenario which I never had done before to minimize planning time. If you want to try the module, you can look for Blood Drive, a scenario in the Hunter Vigil storytelling adventure system. In essence, it's about a group of hunters that have to escort a vampire from New York to Chicago. In essence, the scenario is a not always so cozy road trip. The scenario was a total blast and lauded by my stressed out friends. The problem arose when I, in my utmost ignorance, decided to run another module with the same system, this time including Craig. When I pitched the idea of running Murder Will Out, another Hunter the Vigil game, Craig was positively brimming with excitement. Jake and Jacob, whom you might remember from the previous parts of the saga of Craig, reused their old characters, which are not relevant to the story. Tom, a new guy that had participated in Blood Drive, also reused his character. Craig, on the other hand, was made one of the worst characters I have ever had the displeasure of seeing in action. Craig's character was called Elijah Dante Ramsey, and he was a bit of an abrasive douche. Seeing how the time was available to prepare a decent character was limited, just a week or so, Craig just went into his wish fulfillment zone in the deep recesses of his addled mind. Elijah was a pretty boy private investigator that had left the police force because they were too strict and they followed the rules too much. Elijah was decidedly a quasi-vigilante that worked the streets. He was also a master seducer, gunman, and general badass. Woven tightly into his backstory was Craig's idolized waifu, a sickly, powerless girl without legs that lived in a hospital. She was, of course, incredibly pretty and submissive, just the way Craig likes it. I cannot remember her name, but Craig's character referred to her as Dollface. Ugh. I think he found her when he'd worked a case, back when she had legs and was a typical golden-hearted prostitute with a heavy narcotics problem that Elijah helped her out of. He had set up Dollface to be 100% dependent on Elijah for just about everything. He sent me a picture of a half-naked blonde anime girl taking a shower and said, "Yup, that's her." Well, she does not have any legs anymore, but you can imagine the girl minus 2 legs. Thanks, Craig. Thanks a bunch for sharing. In essence, Craig just wanted to play a wish fulfillment discount James Bond badass that got all the girls and shoots all the bad people. No harm in that, really. The problem arises when you fail to separate your character from yourself. That would be Craig's ultimate downfall. The scenario at hand, Murder Will Out, was about a possessed hospital that had burrowed its tendrils into the minds of a group of psychopaths, turning their murderous instincts up to 11. Following the flow of the scenario, the hunters would investigate these lunatics and find a common denominator, the hospital. Then they were supposed to enter the hospital, purge the living Jesus out of it, and slide out of the trash chute with the hospital exploding in eldritch madness in the background. Not too sure about that last part. A central pre-made NPC was Franklin Kim. He was a police detective that had come into contact with some of these strange supernatural murders, courtesy of the psychopaths and their demon hospital patron, and acted as a primary contact person for the hunters. Now, Franklin was a hot-blooded guy with severe anger issues, and he was also a bit of a condescending dick. He would be sarcastic and demeaning to the hunters, calling out their lack of respect for legal rules and so forth. I made it clear that Franklin was obviously stressed out of his mind, and that they should not take it personally. The sensible hunters just nodded in agreement while Craig clenched his fists in white-hot rage anytime can't do wrong pretty boy Elijah was openly challenged. Elijah, of course, thought Franklin was a bit of a condescending bastard. I mean Craig, not Elijah. Oh wait, they both hated the guy. I always forget that Craig and Elijah were both more or less interchangeable. The scenario went along for the evening. The hunters poked about, investigated, and were attacked in the parking lot by a cannibalistic homeless woman with a magical machete. The usual stuff, things were going nicely. One of these psychopathic killers was an old man that had received a potent gift from the demon in the hospital, a pen that allowed him to write letters of which the content was always perceived as truth or something along those lines. The old man used his gift to manipulate people into killing their spouses, committing suicides, and other horrible things. I set it up so that Franklin Kim received a letter from the old man because the old man was slowly getting clued in about his and the hunters' involvement. The letter to Kim said that the hunters were conspiring with his enemies. Franklin, being stressed as hell, decided to confront the hunters about the contents of the letter. He called them to an empty parking lot in the marina. When they showed up, he screamed at them and demanded answers. The more sensible of the hunters, by that I mean not Craig, managed to calm him down and change his mind. They had clues that there was someone with the ability to manipulate people on an incredibly high level around, and that Franklin must have been victimized. My idea was that the hunters would get the letter, which contained clues from where it was sent. Eventually, this would lead to the old man lunatic. After Franklin had calmed down, the dialogue went something like this. Franklin: "Oh, F me, I've been totally played. I'm effing sorry." Sensible hunter: "It is fine. Will you help us catch this bastard?" Franklin: "Yeah, of course. Now it's effing personal." Sensible hunter 2: "Okay, we're all friends then. Get in the car." Franklin sits down in the front passenger seat. Elijah: "Hey, you sit in back. I sit shotgun." Franklin: "What was that?" Elijah: "I said you sit in the back." Franklin: "Dude, what? You sit in the back." Elijah: "You go sit in the effing back, you mother effer." One of Franklin's blood vessels visibly engorging. Franklin: "You know what? F you. You can't tell me what to do. Unlike you, I'm a real effing detective. You're just a dropout nobody, and you can't tell me shit that I don't know already. Sit down in the back and shut the hell up." Here we freeze time for a moment. You see Franklin sitting in the front passenger seat with the door open and yelling at Elijah. Elijah is stomping his feet like a petulant child, and across the game table, real-life Craig is seething with fury. Now we look at Craig's character sheet. Note the distinct lack of dots and required skills to qualify for working with the police. His academic score was a 0, computer 0, medicine 0, politics 0, brawl 0, literacy 0, intimidation 0, survival 0, and socialize 0. By all rules of the game, he could never work as a police officer. I had explicitly said this to Craig during character creation. I said that guy couldn't be a cop, you have to rearrange his skills. Craig said, okay, whatever, I guess he just cheated his way through the exams and dropped out as soon as he could or something. I answered sure, but then he won't really have any good contacts within the police department. Craig just went, whatever, and wrote in the backstory that Elijah graduated with top marks, best of class. Best of class, my ass. Time resumes. Elijah pulls a gun from his holster with his quick draw skill and points it at Franklin's face. Sensible hunters. Why don't we calm down here? Elijah, put the gun away. Franklin, what the F is that supposed to mean? You gonna shoot me? Elijah, get out of the car. You sit in the back. Sensible hunter 3. Stop it. We're doing exactly what the psychopath wants. Franklin laughing. You know what? No. You are not going to shoot me just because I won't sit in the back. Now put that thing away and let's go. Elijah pulls the trigger, shooting Franklin straight through his right kneecap. Franklin, mother effer. Elijah drags Franklin out of the car and onto the parking pavement. Elijah, you don't speak to me that way. Now shut the F up before I take your other knee. Franklin, howling in pain. You done it now, you little shit. They're going to take you away for good. Police sirens in the distance reacting to the gunshot. Franklin laughing and crying like a crazy person. See, they're gonna nail you so bad. You effing poser. Elijah sits down in the front passenger seat. Elijah, let's go then. We don't need him anymore. Sensible Hunter 1. No, we won't try to outrun the police. You have to drop the gun and try not to make this any worse. Police patrol cars arrive. 2 officers step out and their service guns drawn. Policeman, drop the gun and step out of the vehicle. On your knees and keep your hands where we can see them. At this point, Craig complains that the police showed up on site excessively quick. Franklin, screaming in crazy triumph and adrenaline. You really think I would come here alone? I was prepared to take you all in. You really done effed up now. In a sudden urge of uncharacteristic clarity, Elijah realizes that shooting his way out of this situation would be impossible. He drops the gun and obeys the officer's orders, whom proceed to cuff him and put him in the backseat of the patrol car. Now we go back to the table. Craig is absolutely fuming with poorly veiled rage. He asks if he should just leave, seeing how his character was just put out of commission. I replied that was not necessarily the case, and that the other hunters perhaps would be able to talk with Franklin and have him release Elijah. Craig would have none of that and just start packing up in a very hasty fashion. One of the other players said that he did not have to leave and that they would indeed try to get Elijah out. Their promises fell upon deaf ears and Craig went into the hallway to get dressed in his outdoor clothing. The table was silent for quite a while until I asked, so what do you guys do now? Slowly the game started going again. Suddenly Craig storms into the room again, fully dressed to leave. What follows was more or less incoherent screaming and accusations. To start off, we were all spiteful idiots and bad people. Myself in particular was some form of monster that had it out for him in particular. I stated in my defense that there had to be consequences for everything, that I was sorry he'd taken it so personally. Separating the self from a character is essential, after all. Apparently that was not good enough, and he laid on me all manners of accusations. I was a terrible ST, I was a horrible friend, I made fun of him, I harassed and persecuted him, I was utterly stunned. Never once had he said anything bad about me, at least not to my face or what I know of. On numerous occasions I asked for feedback like, did you guys like this type of scenario? Was it too weird? Is there anything you'd like different in the future? Not once did Craig have anything bad to say. He just kept saying how fantastic everything was. Judging from his meltdown, that was not the case, and everything he had kept locked away just poured out like spiteful vitriol from his mouth. The other players were shocked as well, positively stunned into silence. Craig finished his tantrum with the words, I never want to play with you again, you in particular, and pointed at me. Then he ran out of the apartment and slammed a door as hard as he possibly could, probably waking up the neighbors in the process. We were silent for a little while, then Jacob spoke in a deadpan voice. Well shit, let's play a round of Munchkin to calm ourselves down. We did just that. It was awesome. Munchkin is a great game. The morning after, Craig had erased all contact points with the other players and me. He went completely AWOL and was nowhere to be found. Those of us that remained were more or less relieved that Craig had left. He was our friend, sure, but one of those friends that take energy rather than give energy, you know? The whole ordeal gave not only me, but the entire group a whole different perspective. Together we pieced together the puzzle of Craig, not that it made us that much wiser. At least we concurred that he was a bit of a weird guy, weird enough to warrant a small series on some subreddit at least. Sometimes we talk about his shenanigans as a warning example, but I can't say that we have suffered any lasting damage. He made us stronger if nothing else, and saved us a whole lot of energy drainage. I have no idea what happened to Craig after that. He just disappeared into the mists of life. At one point I know he got a girlfriend. I just hope he realizes that his own bizarre ideals are incompatible with reality and that he treats her well. Hopefully he will grow up and realize that neither Dollface nor Ray is the best girl. They are just idolized ideas of something that is best kept where it belongs, in our fantasies. That's all folks. See you around. TLDR, that guy player is overexcited about a game and then proceeds to paint himself into a corner by kneecapping a police officer, then flips out and accuses the whole group of conspiring against him, willingly terminating his place in the gaming group in the process. And that's the end of part 4. So the writer of the story, I like that you're trying to find some closure, trying to get some lessons out of this. You even talked with the other players about the Craig Saga. After spending an hour with Craig, I can safely say that you probably tried your best. There's always stuff we can improve on, but the fact that you dealt with Craig at all, the fact that you chalked him up as just, one of those friends that drains all your energy all the time, you were being way too kind to the guy. No friend should be like that in the group all of the time. People can be down, sometimes you're going to have to expend a little energy to cheer them up, but if they're constantly a player and they're constantly a friend that's putting you down, that's not a good friend at all. And I too am afraid for the girlfriend. Based on how he writes female characters, the fact that he calls them waifus a lot of the time, yikes. When it comes to this 4 story in particular, it's interesting that you've asked for so much feedback and he kind of just held on to it. And when it finally blew up, he made it sound like he hated you more than anyone else. But based on these other 3 stories, it seems like he plays favorites a lot. And if nothing else, you were definitely the favorite. Not that it's a compliment coming from someone like Craig, but the fact that they said that they hated you in particular and that you're a bad DM, you're a bad ST in this situation, I think he was just trying to say whatever was the most hurtful because he was going to walk out that door and plan to never communicate with you guys again. Not that you really need his approval, but clearly just based on the way you've written these stories, reflection and feedback is something that's very important to you. And that's the first piece of advice that I usually give out for these RPG horror stories. The second piece of advice, and the one you might need a little bit more than others, is resolve the issue a lot quicker. And by that I mean, you clearly know what should be done, and you clearly know how to communicate what should be done. And when a player chooses not to listen, you have to decide if it's worth dealing with that player at all and cutting ties. So the only thing I really wish here is that you were the one that cut ties. Because now that Craig actually cut ties, he still has no accountability. Now, mind you, if you had kicked him out, he still probably wouldn't think much of it. But at least in that scenario, there'd be a second or two of consideration, probably before he dismisses it and calls you guys all a-holes. But he wouldn't get the last laugh, so to speak. If you guys are still listening, thanks for stopping by. Make sure to like and share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you want to break it up into 4 parts, you definitely can. Or you can just kind of give your overall feedback of what you think of Craig. Thanks for stopping by and make sure to subscribe just so you can be around for the next video. I hope to see you in the next one. Farewell for now.